Welcome and hello everyone to our session, Debt, What is it good for and can it be good for you? I'm Caroline Cook, I'm WaterNow's Policy Director, and I'm joined by my colleague Amy Weinfurter, and we'll be supporting today's session. Glad you can join us. So a few housekeeping items before we get started here. So on your Passable landing page, you can submit any technical or logistical questions you have through that chat tab. And we'll be using the poll tab for a few polling questions that we'll be asking you all, but please do wait until we get there. Our moderator will direct you. We will also be having some time in this session for breakouts. If you want to just click one ahead. And I will be describing to you how you can do that and self-select your breakout session. And lastly, we will have a recording available of the session following today's program on that same Passable landing page. So with those housekeeping items underway, will now be my pleasure to introduce our session moderator, Margaret Bowman. Margaret is a consultant helping to promote sustainable and equitable water solutions through better policy, strategy, and investment. She has over 30 years of water conservation expertise, focused primarily on freshwater systems. And so we are so delighted to have Margaret moderating this session today. And with that, I will turn it over to her to introduce our panel and get us going.
Great. Thank you and welcome to the panel. I want to first thank WaterNow Alliance, as well as Caroline in particular. I also want to thank Amy, who's going to be keeping the tech running smoothly.
Margaret, we're having a little trouble hearing you. If you want to try no video for the bandwidth, that might be helpful.
Can you hear me now? Great.
We can, yes.
Great, wonderful. Sorry about that. We're here to talk about debt and explore its role in financing water infrastructure, both traditional infrastructure as well as new innovative types of infrastructure, such as green stormwater and turf buybacks and other distributed solutions. But I've got a question to start out, and maybe you all can show a hand through the reaction thing. How many of you own a house? Anyone own a house? And if you own a house, did you pay for it out of your annual salary? I imagine none of you paid for your house with cash out of your annual salary because most of us borrow money to buy our house. We essentially amortize the cost of the home over the time you live in it. And that same concept applies to water infrastructure. This year's ratepayers shouldn't have to pay for the full cost of infrastructure that future ratepayers are going to benefit from. And that's what debt can do for infrastructure. It enables the cost to be spread out over the life of an asset, or at least part of that life. And I know that's a simplified example, and the financial experts on this panel are cringing right now with my simple example, but that's essentially the concept of municipal debt. Not only can municipalities debt finance water infrastructure, even distributed infrastructure, but they should debt finance it to provide generational equity to their ratepayers. There's a flip side of this, however. Debt financing increases the cost of infrastructure, and municipalities and utilities don't want to overborrow, which impacts their credit rating. And importantly, residents have to ultimately pay for those borrowed funds. And we all know that there's an increasing challenge out there with water rate affordability. And so we need to keep those rates low. These issues and many more are going to be addressed by our impressive panel of experts today. Let me briefly introduce all of them to you, and you can dig into their bios more on the conference platform. Ed Harrington.
Margaret, I think we might have lost you there.
Do you want to just jump in?
Sure. So, Margaret, let us know if you can hear us. But I'll pick up on the the introductions for Ed. So Ed Harrington is a commissioner on the SFPUC, as well as a municipal finance expert who I have the pleasure of working with often on WaterNow issues. We're also joined by David Zimmer, the executive director of the New Jersey Infrastructure Bank. And Margaret, I see you're back if you want to pick it up.
So sorry, I seem to...
No problem. And so, as I mentioned, David is the
connection problems today. So global ratings.
So we're also joined, I'm not sure, Margaret, if you can hear us, but we're joined by Tom Innes, the managing director at D.A. Davidson, who is also a municipal finance expert, an underwriter. We're joined by Ted Chapman from S&P Global Ratings, and Julie Desimoni, Moss Adams, who will share the auditor perspective with us this afternoon, as well as Craig Holland with the Nature Conservancy, the Senior Director of the Urban Water Global Cities Program for TNC. So Margaret, we'll provide you some tech support on the back end, but with that, I'll turn it over to Ed for his segment.
Thanks very much, Caroline. You can get the next slide, please. So we want to talk about debt. And as Margaret was starting to say anyway, debt is not a bad thing. And in fact, in certain circumstances, it's exactly the right thing you should be doing. And it's probably more flexible than you might imagine it to be. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Brief history of debt. Back in the old days, really old days, Roman aqueducts were mostly funded by wealthy individuals, or even when they had war booty, they would just pay for an aqueduct to be built. There was no sense of collectively raising money and buying something. That started to happen later on in the late 1600s. The Bank of England issued debt for the war against France. And the first debt in the United States was for our Revolutionary War. We issued debt of $27 million to help fight that war. But by the 1850s, there was a better sense of needing to share in how we were paying for infrastructure, not just for wars. And the famous Paris sewers were built largely by issuing debt in 1850. Obviously, the world has changed since then, and we are now at the point where last year we issued $38 billion of water and sewer bonds in the United States. So clearly, this is the way that we are now choosing to finance long-term infrastructure needs. Next slide. But this need for debt in water and wastewater is not getting smaller. In fact, it's getting larger. The public sector is about 85% plus of the US water systems are public. And the needs for those systems are $500 billion or more over the next 20 years. And you'll see on the graph that it's up to us. The federal share of capital spending has just not kept up. It is relatively small. We're hoping if this infrastructure bill passes, that will be a boost. But long-term, it has just not been of interest to the federal government to have long-term funding for water and wastewater. There's been peaks and valleys, but it's been pretty low. So 95% of the investments are made by local utilities. Next. And that's going to keep going like that. I mean, the local spending from local governments on water and wastewater is the second largest thing we spend money on. The largest is education. We often think it's public safety or anything else. Now, after education, it really is us. It's water and wastewater infrastructure. And even though we're spending huge amounts of money, $50 billion in 2019, that was only meeting 40% of the need. And so it's going to have to be stepped up. And to step it up, it's going to have to be debt funded. Next. As Margaret said, it's not a bad example. How many of you have a house? How many of you have a mortgage for a house? But practically speaking, you just don't save enough money for big, large purchases. But it's not just practical, it's actually good accounting and economic policy. There's this concept called matching. And matching is that you should match the cost and benefit. So if you're gonna build something, or if you're gonna have something that's gonna have a benefit for your customers for the next 20, 30 years, you should be spreading the cost over those 20 or 30 years. That is kind of why depreciation is part of an accounting, but it also, for debt purposes, you are spreading debt over 20 or 30 years, you are getting a benefit over 20 or 30 years, and that is an appropriate accounting and economic thing to do. It also gets to what Margaret mentioned about intergenerational equity. There's this sense that we should not be burdening our children and grandchildren with the cost of what we have today. On the other hand, we should not be burdening current customers with things that will benefit our children and grandchildren. And so you should be spreading, again, the cost and the benefit over time, and debt does that very, very well. Next. And it's not just that we can issue debt for the traditional things we've always issued debt for. Plants, pipes, treatment systems, those kind of things. The gray infrastructure, easy done, everybody's used to doing it. But really, you can do it. You can issue debt for a lot broader items like distributed green infrastructure, permeable pavement, green roofs, urban tree canopy, land conservation, turf buyback programs, lead line replacement, things that in the past we never would have thought of this. I mean, it's always one of those things for old time accountants. A turf buyback program could actually be an asset on my books, and I can issue debt to do it, is a foreign concept to a lot of your finance people, but it exactly is true. And you can do it, and we'll be talking about that in this session. Next slide shows you a little bit about that too. So next slide, you can do this in a variety of ways. You can own property in the traditional sense. And so the things we're used to doing, we want to put pipes in the ground, we want to build a treatment plant, we issue debt, we own it, we operate it, the world's an easy place. But you can do other things too. You can own assets through contracts and easements. For example, in Las Vegas, they did an entire turf buyback program, and they did it through using contracts and easements. So they had an ownership interest. And because of that, they were able to issue debt and have something on their balance sheet showing that they had an ownership interest in something, and they were issuing debt to make that work. There's also an accounting rule called regulated operations. And what this says is that if you are issuing debt, and if you are spending money, and you are planning on raising rates or keeping rates in line over the future to pay yourself back for spending that money, that receivable, so to speak, of new rates coming in is an asset in itself. And so if you want to issue debt on private property, on public property that you don't own, on a variety of things, and if you're going to go spend that money, you're going to spend it to get a program going in a couple of years with a 30-year payback, you can go ahead and make a regulatory asset and put it on your books, and that offsets your borrowing and makes it available to you to be able to issue debt to spend on these big major programs that you want to have. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Zimmer. David is the Executive Director of the New Jersey Infrastructure Bank. He'll talk to you about the role of the state revolving funds, the SRFs, what the role is they can play in debt finance for water systems, along with some borrower project eligibility requirements, insights into the EPA's WIFIA program, and certain barriers and benefits to using debt from either of these programs. Take it away, David.
Thank you, Ed. Make sure that the slide's up there. Okay, great. For those unfamiliar with the State Revolving Fund or SRF program, it is an annual federal grant program where funds are appropriated from Congress each year to all 50 states to facilitate the design and construction of clean and drinking water projects. just to put some numbers on it, the size of the program last year, as a nation, we received 1.6 billion and 1.1 billion of funds for the clean water SRF and the drinking water SRF respectively. There is a 20% match requirement that every state has to put up and provide in order to receive these annual grant funds. And there's also eligibility requirements. So eligible borrowers, defined in the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, generally include public water systems, public water purveyors, and with some exceptions, inclusions of 501c3 borrowers for clean water projects. And I would just say, think of universities as a good example of this. Eligible projects include water treatment, conveyance and distribution systems, including pump stations, stormwater management projects that include agricultural, landfill leachate systems, green infrastructure, brownfield remediation, pretty much any project that involves water, with the exception of dam-related and flood-related projects, is fair game. Although we always like to say that there's often a stormwater project that's associated with the floodwater project. So if you kind of flip it upside down, most of the flood projects we can get into the system as a stormwater project. I tell all of our potential applicants, if you have a project that includes a water component, don't make any assumptions. Call us, let us figure out a way to get your project into the program. We love being creative. Just as an example, our neighbors to the north in New York State figured out a way to make acid rain a nexus to co-fund an ESIP lighting project at their state residential housing authority, right? So again, if you've got a question, if you've got a project, call up your SRF and see if in fact it can get funded through them. Next slide, please. So this is, you can see the same slide, but I really wanted to focus on the state component, right? So states receive these SRF projects, funds, and they provide the match funds from EPA, and they're in turn required to provide a portion of these grant funds every year to borrowers in specific categories as principal forgiveness grants. So free funds. That's not a loan, you're not borrowing it. Those money are available for qualified projects dependent on the requirements with that year's grant as grants. The remainder of the annual grant gets lent out by each of the states, and the repayments on these loans come in and fund future water projects again and again into perpetuity. So why are SRFs critical to water systems in each state? Because states lend their SRF funds at below market interest rates to make borrowing costs for capital projects cheap, primarily to incentivize more critical projects and make sure those projects get constructed on a timely basis, and also to help keep rates low and more affordable for the system ratepayers. So I think there's 28 states SRF programs that actually go further and leverage the SRF grants that they get and the repayment funds by issuing municipal bonds and adding bond proceeds to the pool of available funds. And in this way, states that do that are able to finance more projects than we would otherwise be able to do with just the available amount of SRF grant and repayment dollars, as well as our state match funds. So you've got quite a bit of funds that are made available. And then on top of it, we go out and we borrow municipal bonds and add those proceeds. Now we can finance a lot of water projects in our state. New Jersey is one of the states that leverages its program with municipal bonds. That's what the iBank does. And you can see from this grant that our water bank financing program uses as sources of funds every year. We use that year's annual grants, the funds that the state put up to get those grants, the repayments that come into our New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection that come back annually, and then the bond proceeds. That, and just to kind of put it in perspective, that allows us to finance and make loans to, on any given year, somewhere between $500 and $800 million worth of projects. All right, so the one thing that, and I'll say this a number of times, but all the states are different. We all get different amounts. It's depending on both need as well as population. But again, if you are a water system looking for cheap funds, you absolutely want to be talking to your state SRFs. So kind of going back to what Ed said, you know, why borrow at all? And specifically, why borrow from your SRF program? I think the first thing systems need to do is they need to consider that every capital investment is a binary option. You can either invest in a capital project today, or you can decide not to invest, keep the status quo. But whatever you do, you need to consider the cost of both options. I can't tell you how many of our systems never consider the fact that if they choose not to invest because they think the debt service is going to be too expensive, they're still making a choice. They're choosing a course that has a cost associated with it. And oftentimes that cost over the long term is higher than if they had gone on and invested in that new piece of equipment back in the day when they were first considering it. So let's just take, for example, the investment option, right? The cost of the project, the debt service, the cost of the project is never just the debt service. You have to factor in the savings that you're going to get from more efficient and lower energy use. Typically, you use less manpower. You have lower labor costs. You're going to have process savings, fewer, cheaper additives, drying time, transportation costs. All of these things go into the savings of your operating costs that offset the cost of your debt service. Sometimes we've even seen projects that are cash flow positive on day one. Take the second option, the cost of inaction. You factor in your inefficient energy costs. You're going to have emergency brakes, right? You look at a car that's 8 years old and you think, oh, I'm going to keep it, but you're going to have to invest in new tires, possibly engine issues, things like that. You're going to have overtime hours. You're going to have rushing and transportation for their parts. You're going to have downtime. So when you net present value the two different options, you may be surprised at how the investment option fares, that oftentimes it is a more beneficial, more responsible choice. So now you know that the investment's warranted and you're asking yourself, how am I going to pay for it? Because I don't have the cash to pay for it. And I go back to what Margaret and Ed said, right? The debt makes sense. Every water system is a cash flow generating asset, which means any long-term benefit that helps produce that cash flow can be borrowed against, right? The cost of that benefit should be borne by the people receiving the benefit over the life of that asset. This whole intergenerational equity concept that I am now the third consecutive speaker to talk about. Your responsibility now becomes, okay, how do I minimize the cost of that financing? And this is where your state SRF can make a difference. I will state, we are all different. We're managed different. We have different state laws and regs. We're set up differently. But we all have the common goal of providing funding for our water systems that is cheaper than where those systems can borrow independently. And just as an example, here in New Jersey, we lend our SRF dollars and our state match fund dollars at 0% interest. We lend our bond proceeds at the cost of those proceeds. So your typical borrower that will get half of their funds from the state and half of the funds from the municipal market ends up with a cost that is 50% of our AAA rate. We have a number of AAA borrowers that come in year after year and borrow from our program because it's 50% of where they can borrow. So you can imagine how much single A and triple B borrowers end up saving. In fact, we calculate on a 30-year loan, an average town that's single A rated will save 25% on their debt service payments over the life of a 30-year loan. And this cheaper financing cost makes projects financially more viable when compared to the option of the status quo. It often allows the systems to construct a second or third project under their annual budget. Last slide, please. So the final option I want to speak about is the WIFIA program. And I'll just very quickly say, because I don't work for EPA, but this is an incredible program. The Water Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act is the federal loan program run by EPA to provide financing to water projects nationally. And unlike the SRF program, there's no limitation on borrower eligibility. Although there are credit requirements in a competitive application process, but there's also a good bit of structuring flexibility with respect to timing and repayments. So there's a lot of pluses for anybody that's looking at debt and trying to minimize that debt, okay? You get to borrow at the US Treasury's rate. So that is the cheapest rate out there. Now they only lend up to 49%, but still, if you could get half of your funds where the US government borrows funds, you can understand how attractive this program can be. Oftentimes, WIFIA loans are combined with SRF loans to finance large projects. Sometimes they're done as a standalone loan, and sometimes they're done as a source of funds within the SRF program. For example, Indiana did the first version of this a couple of years ago. In New Jersey, we're actually in the second round of this. We're in the process of negotiating and finalizing our WIFIA loan that we hope will settle within the next 2.5 months to finance a $500 million portfolio of SRF projects. So again, sometimes it makes sense to borrow as a standalone loan. Sometimes it makes sense to go through your SRF program and have them borrow the WIFIA funds for you. But every state's different, and I recommend that individuals interested in WIFIA check with both EPA and your state SRF to consider if your SRF is an appropriate option with WIFIA. So that's it for me. I'm going to turn the session over now to Tom Innes. Tom manages the National Water Utility Practice for DA Davidson. He's going to talk to you about the role the underwriter plays in the issuance of a public bond financing, and also discuss an additional financing tool available to fund localized infrastructure projects. Tom?
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. I'm going to have my video on for a second. I'm having some connection issues as well, and then I just to say hello. Then I'll cut it off, and hopefully you can hear me. Please, anyone on the host line, let me know if I'm cutting out, and I can repeat what might have missed out. So yeah, thanks, David, appreciate it. So what I'm trying to discuss is the role of the underwriter in financing options for localized infrastructure. So when we say localized infrastructure, I'm assuming it's smaller financings. And if you can just advance to the next slide, I'll tackle the role of the underwriter. I don't know if you can, we have some bullet points there. If we can advance to the next slide. I don't know if you can hear me. Great, perfect. So I will say the role of the underwriter is primarily with publicly offered bonds. If we're a good underwriter, we'll also help out with the SRF and WIFIA programs as they tie into bonds. And as you know, as David alluded to, SRF and WIFIA, those are the first two options you go to for debt borrowing. Even as an underwriter, I'll always advocate for that because that's the lowest cost of borrowing. But you have to co-borrow. You can't typically fund projects for larger projects with just those two offerings. So bond offerings are also included. The one thing I will say, working as an underwriter, which is good for borrowers, is that we're highly regulated. So much so that I'm the only presenter that had to put a disclosure slide in the back of my section. And from that slide, I'll spare you the rest of it when we get there. But we do call out that the primary role of an underwriter is to purchase as principal or arrange for the placement of securities in an arm's length commercial transaction with the issuer. So what you see here in the overview and specifics on what slide 14 is bullet points directly pulled from the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board that we, again, because we're regulated, I didn't want to get anything wrong, but we have pulled out in our own disclosure the arm's length concept, the 30,000 foot level, but providing the proceeds. And that's ultimately what we do as underwriter is we work with investors to obtain funds to get you your issuer needs. The last part of it, if it's a larger issuer, we might have other underwriters as well. Regarding specifics, again, we work with the full finance team, the local government, the municipal advisor, should you have one. With that team, we develop the bond structure, assist with the timing on the bond, assist with the development of the documents, and assist in preparing any rating agency presentation. But fundamentally, our primary job is to run the numbers, as said, shown here in quotes, to provide the quantitative analysis, and also to consider how it would incorporate into other borrowings, such as SRF and WIFIA. But again, fundamentally, whether the rubber meets the road, the role of the underwriter is to find investors, to sell the bonds to hopefully not have to underwrite the bonds themselves, and then be able to provide proceeds to the issuer at day of closing. With that, I'll get into the options for localized infrastructure financing, which has already been touched on by Ed and David. So if we can go to the next slide. Great. So these are the 5 primary options. I would say the first four have been traditional primary options, and then the last one we'll get into on on the next slide, which is already, and have to answer questions. I understand I'm breaking up a little bit, so I will slow down. The first option listed, which subject matter expert on the panel, David, did a great job talking about the SRF programs. Again, as an underwriter, even I'd advocate for using that as the first option. It's typically the lowest cost of borrowing. Water Infrastructure Financing Innovation Act, or WIFIA. David stole my thunder. The borrowing rates there are also very low. I would say that for localized infrastructure or smaller borrowings, it's probably not cost effective because there's a high entry fee of north of $100,000. And we typically advocate to look at WIFIA if you're looking at a $25 million or more borrowing. And again, I failed to mention, but David did a great job. SRFs, it's state by state. New Jersey runs very well, and I'm not just saying that because David's on the line. I'm in California. I actually we do bond financings for the SRF program, so we're very close with them, but it's not the most efficient. And so right now, probably not an option for localized infrastructure, as I'm calling it. Publicly offered revenue bonds, again, that's where underwriters come in. That's municipal bonds. Again, economies of scale. If you're looking at a deal less than $5 million, most investors probably won't lift their heads on that, which means you can still issue it, but you're going to get the lowest cost of borrowing. And then leading to private placement, that's where you directly place your debt with a bank. That usually comes, and I'm not trying to prevent people from looking at private placements, but it usually comes with slightly more onerous requirements, document requirements, and also a higher rate. So based on the four options that have been traditionally available, we helped develop the water wastewater pooled bond program, which is the last bullet point on slide 15, that's issued through the Public Finance Authority. And the Public Finance Authority is the only conduit that's based out of Wisconsin. It's the only issuer conduit, which means it can issue on the behalf of a potential borrower across state lines. So what we've developed here is a program that theoretically a smaller issuance from Maryland could pull up with a smaller issuance from Indiana, for a smaller issuance from Florida, smaller issuance, not necessarily from California because it has its own conduit program. So it provides an alternative so that if you do have a smaller borrowing, 1 to 5 million, and we'll show the details in the next slide, that those can be pulled into a larger financing, say north of 25 million, 30 million. You can wrap it with insurance, so then you're now borrowing at AA rates. And that then, if that's achievable, then that moves up. If you're rank ordering these bullets on slide 15, that would move up just behind the WIFIA in terms of borrowing rate. So it's a new alternative, and I think exciting and applicable to WaterNow's efforts, and particularly with localized infrastructure that may result in smaller financing. So if we go to the next slide, and we have the link there that if these slides are able to be provided, you can find that link. But what you'll find in that link, basically what I provided on slide 16, I know it's a lot of words and I'm not going to go line item by line item, but the benefits, as I already touched on, is low cost of borrowing available through a public offering that you might not have available to you as a smaller issuance. We're looking to streamline reporting burdens, and we'll get into how that works on the borrowing requirements. And it's a fast and certain access to co-funding or total funding. And so what I mean by co-funding is, again, you can use this even if you have a larger borrowing need, if you are able to get SRF or WIFIA funding, but you still need a smaller portion of bond financing to go with it. So important considerations on eligibility, sole provider in the service area, more than 1,000 connections, more than 5,000 total population. You need to have the individual rate setting authority. And again, loan amounts ranging from 1 million to 30 million. If we get to a point where it's borrowing, individual issuer borrowing at 30 million, we'd probably advocate looking to SRF or a straight bond offering on your own. And with most water, wastewater financing, the pledge would be the same of gross or net system revenues. So the nuance of it, where PFA gets involved, and hopefully individual issuer is the PFA and underwriter, should it be Davidson or other, would review the form agreement and help mitigate with requirements. So we're working through a standardized form to get that done. You'll see the other requirements, which are typical of a revenue bond financing: 120% of annual debt service, or otherwise known as 1.2 times debt coverage. One nuance just for system, just to keep things track, is we'd look to have 1/10 of annual debt service paid as monthly deposits. And then again, just skipping ahead to where you really gain the benefit is as we roll it up to a larger issuer, you're able to get insurance from, we're tied in with Assured Guarantee Mutual. So that's what will get you your AA borrowing rates. But with that, you're going to have to be approved by AGM, to go forward. But again, working with PFA and Davidson will be sure to get you there. So I think it's an exciting alternative. And again, teamed up with WaterNow about 2 years ago on this, because we do think there's a lot of synergy between this pooled program and the types of borrowings that WaterNow would be associated in the types of clients that are working with WaterNow at this point. So that's my section. Again, the disclosures on the next page, but I think I pulled out the most important parts. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ted Chapman from S&P. He'll be providing rating agency considerations and impacts on cost of borrowing. So Ted, take it away.
Very good, Tom, thank you. Thank you to everybody at WaterNow for the opportunity to chat with you today. I don't have slides, so you're just stuck with my better for radio, not for TV face. But I will tell you that if your utility does pursue the municipal bond option, this is typically like the rating agencies will enter the process after you've already engaged somebody like Tom. And I guess in keeping with the theme today with Margaret's analogy of a mortgage, I think the analogy is very apt. Bond ratings it's really like your personal credit score, so that the better it is, the lower your cost of borrowing is going to be. And I think David also gave some good observations about that. Now, I will tell you, borrowing, I mean, among the various, there's many choices of how you finance or just fund your infrastructure. Borrowing is going to be your highest cost of paying for the infrastructure, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a high cost. Now, what do you mean by that? Okay, well, fine. You've got, maybe you do utilize the state or federal loan programs, the SRF, maybe you do USDA. Sometimes there's even strategic reasons, not economic reasons, to utilize USDA. You can find an interest rate that's almost zero, but it still makes economic sense and probably a fair amount of political sense to at least do your due diligence and find out and how to make the best use of your customers' money. And I think, as Ed noted, most of us are served by a water utility that's owned and operated by your local municipality. Local governments, they don't truly have owners per se. I mean, I guess, yes, obviously, taxpayers, ratepayers, that's your chain, your line of accountability, but you don't have true owners in the sense of like a corporation. So a local utility, a local government doesn't have the option to do an IPO or, sell shares of stock. So they are going to borrow. Not all of them, many of them do. Some try to do pay as you go and just do a little bit at a time. We talked about the reasons you may choose to borrow, but the universe of borrowers is pretty big. It's actually really big. It's kind of an understatement. To put it in perspective, there's about 3.9 trillion with a T. There's about 3.9 trillion in municipal bonds outstanding. They're held by various different, maybe it's a pension fund, a 401k. Maybe you have some that you own through, E-Trade or Ameritrade or something like that. Maybe your life insurance is a big investor in municipal bonds. They want to make sure, when I gack out, I sure want to make sure that my policy is liquid, and so that my next of kin, my wife and kids, have some cash. So, it's typically viewed as maybe it's not you're going to hit the lottery on it, but it's likely you're going to have lesser risk associated with that. And even at $3.9 trillion, that's still only about 1/3 the size of the corporate bond market. Now, traditionally, again, fixed income investors, you want to make sure that you are typically the strategy that we see most often, their preservation of their capital, of their principal. You know, I put some money in, I at least want to get that much money back out of it, plus some kind of a rate of return. Now, increasingly what we are seeing, and it's been around for 10, 15, 20 years, but it's become very popular in recent years, is this idea of environmental, social, and governance strategies to investing. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, it very broadly falls under the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing, very closely aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals that came into being. That's a little bit more recent. But I mean, overall, the idea is run your government, run your corporation the right way. The right way meaning basically don't lie, cheat, or steal, be transparent, treat people well, both your citizens, your employees, internally, externally, be good stewards of the environment. And environmental stewardship, that's obviously, you know, that's the easy one to measure, but I mean, probably you've heard it called impact investing. Investors want something in their portfolio that they feel good about, and it aligns with whatever your personal view is of making a positive impact in some type of particular way. Now, utility leaders, they just sort of shrug this off. You know, they stretch and they yawn and they get out of bed and say, look, ESG, I mean, I do that just by showing up to work every day. I just, you know, the utility sector has been calling it the triple bottom line for the last 30 years. But this is what I do. This is my business model. I don't need to do anything above and beyond or different or novel or alternative. And I'd like to say that our bond rating criteria reflects that. So, I mean, you know, again, it's sort of like your credit score. It's very much like your credit score for when you're, you know, pursuing a mortgage to buy a home. The better that is, the more likely, the more favorable your cost of borrowing is likely to be. And so, you know, deeply embedded in our criteria is, yes, we do look at the traditional financial metrics, cash flow, cash reserves, the debt, not just how much you have, but what type of debt you have, because it's pretty uncommon, but there's always the possibility that municipals could be a little bit aggressive with some of the provisions of the debt. You know, the payback provisions typically, it's almost like a contract with the investors. The utility promises to do certain things or even not do certain things to make sure that the investors get their money back, that principal plus interest. So yes, that is part of what we look at. Literally only 50% of what we look at. The other half of what S&P looks at, and it's in our criteria, it's our guidebook, our playbook, that here's our promise to you. We're being transparent of here's how we look at things, here's how we measure things. Even if it's kind of hard to measure, here's what we look at sort of qualitatively. The other half of what we look at is a deep dive into the brick and mortar of the utility itself, the operational aspects. And that goes very deeply into stuff that is very closely aligned with the triple bottom line, with the ESG aspects of it, whether you're looking at affordability or EJ issues that might be associated with the S, the social aspect. Certainly good governance is important for any entity, a government, a corporation, a private company. That just, you know, that's pretty obvious. And then again, the environmental stewardship, that's pretty self-evident as well. I mean, that's sort of, you know, again, you're not going to earn $1 of operating revenues unless you have assets that are high functioning. But oh yeah, by the way, you want to make sure that it's safe. I mean, you have a public health and safety mandate, and that's probably above all else what utility managers strive to achieve. So yeah, my company, S&P, was actually one of the first signatories to this United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing. We've committed ourselves to incorporating ESG in general, climate in specific, into our rating analyses. So yeah, I'm going to ask a utility, like when I have that conversation, I need to learn stuff about helping inform my opinion so I can assign the right bond rating, the right credit rating. And so yes, again, we look at the traditional financial metrics, but I also want to know about, you know, climate risk management, for example. I want to know what you, the utility management and governance team, are doing to make yourselves resilient, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. because there's some things that are in your control. There's some things that you're going to have to be a little bit reactive to, but think along the lines of long-term water supply planning. That's a pretty obvious one. I mean, if you were to look at like the US Drought Monitor on any given day, especially lately, you go pretty much anywhere west of the Rockies, there's a lot of yellow and red. I mean, it's not lining up to be a real good summertime, and it could be another one of those prolonged situations of drought. So yeah, if you don't have a long-term water supply, like let's say that you've got bonds, you know, that maybe go out 25 years, but you tell me in that discussion, yeah, I think our aquifer is good for about another 10 to 15 years before it really starts to get brackish or maybe fails. That seems to be an operational misalignment. So that would be an example where you're telling me that your long-term ability to serve might need some enhancements, to put it politely. So, I mean, very simply, if in our view you're doing these things well, it'll be additive, it'll be positive for the overall credit rating. And it might be day-to-day stuff like the water conservation program. Maybe it's bigger challenges that you and your long-term plan say, yeah, the aquifer, it's not looking good as far as quantity and quality over time. We're going to have to start thinking about DPR, direct potable reuse. Or I heard a utility manager call it certified pre-owned once, which I thought was great. Sounds a lot better than toilet to tap. But you know, some of these things are hard to measure, admittedly, but you know it's still important to being a successful utility. And things like green infrastructure, wetlands restoration, you know, semi-permeable pavement, things like that. Yeah, it maybe is a little bit harder to measure, but you know it has some kind of positive impact. You know that you're displacing some amount of overflows that might have otherwise fouled a waterway and caused a Clean Water Act violation. Because from what we've seen roughly the past 20 to 30 years, the single thing that is most likely to make a utility's capital budget go sideways is an unfunded mandate. And it's usually on the wastewater side, the clean water. Maybe you've got I&I issues that have caused overflows. Maybe you just got aging, failing infrastructure. And we all know there's a massive infrastructure funding gap. That is most likely going to cause your capital budget to explode. That puts pressure on rates. That has the chance to weaken your financial credit quality. All of those things could be negatively impactful to your overall credit rating. So I think typically, yeah, it sounds like a lot of buzzwords, but I will say that the investor community, it does hold the drinking water community in very high regard. No, we've got roughly almost 1,700 ratings on utilities across the United States. Our modal rating, our most common rating, it's A+. So if you were to look at it, think of it sort of like a temperature scale where like, you know, maybe below 0 might be speculative grade. Maybe you might call it junk bonds. We don't call it that. And then the higher you go, the better your credit quality is, all the way up to our highest rating of AAA. So A+ is towards the top. Way into the investment grade end of the rating spectrum. Now, to put that in perspective, and hopefully this makes you feel pretty good about things, is that the typical corporate non-financial rating, so your typical company that might be rated by S&P, they tend to be speculative grade, typically 8 to 9 notches below that A+. So, I mean, overall, I would say yes, there's a lot to consider. You're telling me, oh my gosh, you look at qualitative stuff too. I thought it was just the financials. I thought it was just the books. Well, no, it's a lot more than that. But I will tell you that overall, we have Wall Street in general has a very high opinion. And that doesn't mean that you get like a free pass. I mean, we all know there's a lot of challenges out there. I mean, we see buzzwords and anecdotes about that all the time. You know, the Society for Civil Engineers just updated their 2021 report card. The presidential administration is talking about a potential infrastructure package. I mean, how many times have we heard infrastructure week the last 4 or 5 years? So, I mean, we know that there's a lot to tackle. We know that you typically, as a utility manager, tend to have a long-term planning horizon, but you put those projects into place on a just-in-time basis. But it always gives your investors a more warm, fuzzy feeling that you at least have connected the dots between the planning and the action. So with that being said, I'll try and shut up now. I'm going to turn it over to Julie just to introduce her. So if very briefly, maybe you've even worked with her before. She's been with Moss Adams doing accounting, auditing, and consulting services for 20 years now. She has clients in the energy and utility industry. including enterprise funds of government. So maybe many of you on the line with us today. She has specific areas of focus that include advanced utility accounting, regulatory assets and liabilities, single audit. So if you've got some federal money out there, you probably have talked to her as well. Contracting, internal control evaluation, litigation support, and relationship management. She's currently on her firm's training and development committee, audit task force, and recruiting program, and is also a regular speaker on this circuit. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thanks, Ted. Appreciate it. I'm going to make this pretty short and sweet and talk a little bit more about the regulatory accounting piece of it. And really what we wanted to talk about is one of the limitations that we see in people's minds as they're going towards these programs is sometimes the assets and the infrastructure that we're trying to fund, we're not going to own. And in a utilities history, we generally will own those assets. They're brick and mortar types of assets, and that's what we fund through debt instruments. But there is some alternatives out there, and we have been seeing some really effective use of these alternatives through the use of regulatory accounting that have said that if we're going to be putting down infrastructure, putting down assets that aren't going to be owned by the utility, maybe they'll be managed by the utility, but not owned by the utility, but we're still going to use debt financing, then what we're going to utilize is something termed regulatory accounting, which isn't used too much in the water space. It is used quite a bit more on the electric side of the house, but it is not used as much in the electric or in the water space. But what we're going to say is if those bonds are going to be paid through your rate system over a period of years, generally between 15 to 30 years, we're going to go ahead and record a regulatory asset, put it on the balance sheet and amortize that as it's coming back through the rate structure. So just because those are traditional expenses today doesn't mean that they have to be traditional expenses in the future or not recorded exactly the same way because of this use of regulatory accounting. We encourage that everybody out there get to know regulatory accounting because we think that this could be very effective in getting some new debt and streams and being able to help some of the infrastructure that just isn't going to be owned by the utility specifically. We'll have a breakout session if you do want to get more into the dynamics. I'm not going to go through the debits and credits of regulatory accounting or get too in depth in that, but we wanted to let you know that there's just another solution out there. There's another solution in play that hasn't historically been thought of that we'd like to put on the table for consideration as you are looking for what is going to be the right way to finance some of these projects going on to the future. So from that, I'm going to turn it over to Craig Holland to highlight the alternative financing methods.
Thanks so much, Julie. Let's take a breath for a second. We just had a lot of information thrown our way. Thank you all for joining us. If we could go on to the next slide, I really appreciate it. So I think it's probably safe to say that everyone at this conference knows that urban water quality management is a persistent issue across many communities, mostly because the solutions to the challenge are very expensive and hard to scale. And a successful public debt offering is not sufficient in all circumstances to meet community goals. And this can be for a variety of reasons. Communities can have no debt capacity. They might not have a reliable revenue stream with which to leverage. They might be legally limited in where they can invest, typically limited to projects in the public right of way. But ideally, you want to manage pollution at its source. And in other words, you want to, in the stormwater case, you want to manage rain where it falls. And to do so, you need to figure out an efficient way to partner with private landowners, something that government agencies who are tasked with stormwater management typically find challenging to do. So what you've seen is a lot of policy innovation at the state and local levels around incentivizing private property participation in stormwater management, though successful execution of those programs has been a bit uneven. And in the context of stormwater, you really must engage private landowners as they, as you can see here from this statistic, account for most of the land ownership in urban and suburban communities where stormwater is most prevalent. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I want to quickly take you through some innovative solutions to moving financing for stormwater activities off the balance sheet of the municipality, while also incentivizing private property participation in stormwater management. And there are many reasons municipalities want to move that financing off their balance sheet, though I would say the most common reasons are project delivery risk management, as I said earlier, the inability to access the debt markets. They may want to pilot new approaches or technologies. And finally, they might want to shift the compliance burdens from the public to the private sector. So what you see here is a model for that last example, shifting the burden of compliance to the private sector. Many of you have heard about the Washington, D.C. stormwater retention credit trading market. For those that haven't, I'm happy to discuss it in more detail during the breakout sessions. In short, D.C. passed a post-construction stormwater ordinance, but allows private developers to meet that obligation offsite by purchasing stormwater retention credits. Delivery of those credits come from aggregators that raise private capital, typically construction debt finance. That's that aggregators of the circle in the middle there. And then they build credit supply on private property and sell the resultant credits to developers. Developers then turn those credits over to their regulator, to local regulator, to meet their compliance obligations. And then in turn, that regulator then uses that compliance to meet its own NPDES permit goals. Next slide, please. Oh, one back, please. Thanks. So here is another example, which is almost identical to the DC work. The difference here is that the buyer, the gray circle on the left, is a municipality or a public agency with a compliance obligation rather than a private developer. So in this case, the aggregator, again, finances, designs, builds, delivers, and in some cases performs long-term O&M for the buyer, the public agency. The projects that I've seen that follow this structure are typically done in jurisdictions where the regulating agency can certify an outcome. For example, in the Chesapeake Bay, nitrogen or sediment reduced. And then the aggregator transfers that outcome to the regulated agency, again, the gray circle on the left, in exchange for a predetermined payment. Unlike the DC example, the regulator in this case is usually the state agency that enforces the NPDES permit compliance. And they're also, that same regulator is also the regulator that typically permits the project on behalf of the aggregator. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is the final example, and it's one where the public agency and a private development company partner to deliver projects on both public and private land. And some of you may have heard this referred to as a community-based public-private partnership, or CBP3 model. The two partners create a new legal vehicle. That's the green circle in the middle. The public agency pledges a portion of its revenue to the new entity, which the new entity then leverages to raise financing. And the financing can be public debt, like SRF, private debt, or some blend. The proceeds are then used to develop projects, which is typically the service that's provided by that private development company. And a key reason why a regulated agency might take this approach is that the new partnership has greater flexibility in raising capital. It might have greater flexibility in procurement or other programmatic innovations that the agency itself might not be able to do on its own. However, unlike the other examples, the agency in this case would still retain a level of control over project administration and delivery than it might not otherwise. If we can go to the next slide, please. So in all of these examples, I've highlighted the need for project developers. They're critical to making any of these models work. And this is because on the supply side, you have property owners that in some instances lack the technical sophistication, the financing, or the will to go build projects. And also those same property owners typically don't know how to access governmental buyers through these marketplaces, which can have arcane procurement rules. In other words, the landowners who might have the great project sites to meet your goals as a water utility, they can't necessarily act as their own project developers. And then on the demand side, there's skepticism, that the market can deliver what you need on time, on budget, with long-term maintenance assurances. So this is where a good project developer comes in, because it can bridge the divide between these two constituencies. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And finally, I should mention that TNC, the Nature Conservancy where I work, is working in this project developer aggregator space. And we're doing this both to develop projects consistent with our conservation mission, but also to show the way for other companies to participate in these markets. So just one example, we're now the largest credit aggregator in the DC market. And on average, we're delivering projects 70% cheaper than the public sector, in this case, the Department of Energy and the Environment for the Washington, DC government, mainly because we're delivering projects on private land and not in the public right-of-way, which is where DOE is typically limited in doing their projects. So with that, I will turn it back over to Margaret for the next part of our discussion. And I really appreciate you all listening. Thanks.
Margaret, are you with us still? So while Margaret is navigating her volume there, we will send you over to the landing page to participate in a few polls. And we're gonna just run through these kind of quickly. I put in the chat the link back to the landing page. So to vote, you can click on that green vote button that you'll see on that landing page. And we'll get some reactions from our panel once we run through these 5 questions, which the first up is.
And I'm here, so I can do it. Sorry about that.
All right, take it away, Margaret.
So we've got 5 polls for you all. Hopefully you're all on the poll page on Pathable. Triple P. The first poll up is what best describes your attitude towards borrowing funds for your capital needs. If you want to vote, and we can see the results come up. Looking like a lot of people are comfortable with that. For the second one, does your utility borrow to finance large capital investments like treatment plants, pipes, and tanks? Great. The third question is true or false? Water use efficiency, green stormwater infrastructure, on-site reuse, and other distributed strategies fall within the definition of water infrastructure. Wow, it's nice to see everyone thinking that's true. Fourth poll question, have you or your utility ever seriously considered using municipal bonds or other forms of debt to fund consumer rebates for green infrastructure, water use efficiency, or reuse programs? About 40%, a little over 40%. And finally, have you or your utility ever seriously considered using mechanisms other than municipal revenue or general obligation bonds, such as stormwater credit trading or public-private partnerships, to fund consumer rebates for green infrastructure, water use efficiency, or reuse programs? Interesting. Great. Well, thank you for all the feedback. We're going to have our panelists react to this. And since we're running over time a bit, we're going to ask each panelist in one sentence, one short, efficient sentence to react to these poll results. So we'll start with Ed. We're going to go in the same order. Ed, what's your thought?
One long sentence, the utility borrowing 86% saying that they're willing to borrow is great news, because last time we did this, a lot of people that were answering it said they were opposed to debt financing. This is a good sign, I think, that they're open to it.
I would agree. Ted, since you popped up?
Well, I mean, I can't advocate for you to do one or the other, but I will say that Craig makes a very good point that I think was hammered home by that last question on alternative financing. One of the things that we have seen is that it's been a messaging battle. It's a shift of risk. I mean, I think that's truly one of the key takeaways. You know, you might be limited by local procurement laws or some other such kind of traditional methods to invest in your infrastructure. And sometimes there's just sort of like, I'm hesitant because it sounds like the other side, the private equity or whoever, is going to have some kind of a profit margin. So, I mean, I think the risk management aspect that he pointed out, and I know that's way more than one sentence, but I think that's a very important point.
Excellent, thank you. David. I think you're on mute still, David. Well, does Julie or...
Can you hear me now?
There you go, David. Yep.
Yeah, so I was particularly enthusiastic about the openness for considering alternative financing, both in the first and the last questions, because, excuse me, I think, and maybe this is me just being a finance guy that's in the market every single day, but we do the same thing all the time, right? And the fact that we're starting to get more and more into green bonds and ESG bonds and looking at alternative structures, and we've got new programs coming in from the feds. I think the opportunity for those individuals that need to do capital projects and taking on debt to do so are going to have a lot more opportunities than what we used to show people 10 years ago.
Thank you, David. Tom, what are your reactions?
Yeah, this is, sure, I'll just jump in on David's line. In the years that I've been working on this, I mean, I'm an underwriter, so I like debt, and I like publicly traded bonds, but I think you can see that I've also had the opportunity to work on innovative financings techniques, other, I shouldn't say innovative, but other structuring options like the SRF and WIFIA program. In fact, I worked with Ed's company, San Francisco Public Utility Commission, for their $1 billion project that incorporated SRF, WIFIA, and revenue bonds. And I've also, we've worked on developing this PFA alternative for the smaller size. So I'm encouraged by the alternatives that are out there that weren't there, say 10, 20 years ago, ranging from WIFIA to larger projects to the full water, wastewater bonds to the smaller projects. So there was other alternatives out there that we didn't touch on. So I am also encouraged that folks are willing to step into that, the debt pool, if you will.
That's great. Yeah. Julie, what are your reactions?
Yeah, more of the same as the rest of the group. One thing that I was thinking is that, in the next 30, 40, 20, 30, 40 years, what we're being mandated to look at from an infrastructure standpoint, from a conservation standpoint, is like nothing we've done before. And to truly be able to move the needle in an efficient fashion, I think we just have to think outside the box. And that's where this is starting to come. It feels like it's more comfortable to be looking at different sources, not what I would consider as the traditional sources only of the past, and not limiting ourselves to just to tradition. So I think it's very encouraging. I think it's exciting. And because I think we're going to have to think this way in order to move the needle forward.
Yeah, I think you're right, Julie. Okay, Craig, you can close it up. Everyone's talking about alternative financing.
Yeah,
I bet you have an opinion on that.
I do, and I was happy to hear it. I mean, I suspect that if we took those same the last 3 of those poll questions, even 4 years ago, we'd have widely divergent responses. I mean, we would probably have a lot more no's than we have yeses. So it's encouraging to see people getting comfortable and familiar with those concepts. And I can tell you that, a lot of the investors that I speak to cut their teeth in both the renewables and energy efficiency space, which are obviously much further ahead in terms of comfort level and being able to access these types of structures and do projects against them. But what they're seeing are a lot of similarities in those spaces, say 10 years ago now in the water space. So I suspect that in 5 to 10 years from now, a lot of these alternative financing structures, being able to, access them for distributed infrastructure projects or more just creative, innovative projects outside of the centralized wastewater world, are just going to become quite commonplace. So I'm excited to see that world.
That's great. All right, Caroline is going to tell us some logistics about our small groups, where we can dig into some of these details in a little bit more smaller sessions. So Caroline, what are the logistics, or is it Amy?
I'll cover that. Absolutely. Thank you, Margaret. So I'm going to launch our breakout rooms here, and you'll be able to join one of 3 rooms to connect directly with our excellent panelists today. And you'll see a red icon should pop up. And if you click on that, you'll be able to see the 3 breakout rooms. And if you hover over the number on the far right of that breakout screen, you should have the option to join the themed rooms, which are, the first will be Ed and Ted, to cover debt financing or bond financing of distributed infrastructure and credit rating implications. You can join Tom, Julie, and David to talk about underwriter and auditor perspectives. And then you'll be able to join with Margaret and Craig to talk about some of these alternative funding and financing approaches that we've been discussing. And Margaret, we will assign you into a room since you're joining us by phone. And for other folks who have any troubles accessing that breakout room, not to worry, we can assign you as well. Feel free to let us know that in the chat and we'll get you assigned. And we'll have about 10 minutes for the discussions, and then we'll reconvene for a quick report out. All right, do we have everyone back from the breakouts?
We do from our breakout.
All right, Margaret, I'll turn it back over to you to.
Great, I think we'll have a quick round the room summary of what happened in the breakout discussions. Craig, do you want to start with a kind of one to 2 sentence summary of what was discussed in our breakout session?
Sure. There was a pretty big conversation around green bonds and environmental impact bonds and the distinction between them and where we think the trends are in the future towards those types of structures. And there was also a question as to the future of community-based public-private partnerships and where we might see them going in the future, since there seems to have been a downturn in those types of structures.
Excellent. Yeah, it was an interesting discussion. Tom, Julie, and David, who's reporting out from your discussion?
So I think it might make sense to actually split this, because I certainly couldn't speak with the type of authority that I would expect Julie would have on the accounting question that we got. But there was a portion of the discussion we spent on what kind of funds are going to be made available over the next year or two, and how should utilities really get set to take advantage of that? Like, how do they plan for this? And I think the consensus is that there isn't a whole lot of guidance coming out of DC just yet, because it's very early on in the process. But the key is going to be, we always see construction ready projects. We're going to make X amount ready, and those projects got to get to construction and use the funds within the next 3 to 5 years, or whatever constraint the feds put on it, right? And so the recommendation is just make sure that if you're thinking about doing a project, start the engineering, design, and planning and get it underway now, so that whether the funds come in and they're made available directly to water systems through the state, and that, let's say that it's a competitive application process, or it comes in through the SRFs in the same way, you're going to have projects that are pretty close to construction bid in order to be available for those kind of funds. So again, the recommendation, plan for it. Start with your engineering, your design, get your lists set up, and make sure that when those funds come in, you're talking to your state representatives or your SRF program immediately. And Julie, do you want to handle the accounting?
Sure, I'll just speak a couple words to it. We were just talking about the regulatory accounting, and a great question came up as to why we're not seeing this maybe utilized as much as maybe on the electric side or just in other entities utilized too much. And the true answer is because it's a very unique accounting. It is just to pretty much regulatory utilities within the US. It's not an international. And so the level of comfort, I mean, you still talk to many accountants out there that don't have a clue what this regulatory accounting is. And so it's just not utilized on the water side nearly as much as it is on the more traditional side on the electric. And I think that one other key that I'm not sure I said before, but I just want to make is what you are really doing, what creates the asset is not what you do with the money. So you can give it to somebody else as long as it's in line with the bond, with the debt agreement. But you can give the money to somebody else, but you're really creating the asset is your utility saying, yes, we will pledge a revenue stream in order to do what we need to do. So if you take $1 million bond out and you've got principal and interest payments that you're pledging that you will set a revenue stream sufficient to be able to capture in those principal and interest through the life of the bond. That pledge is really what creates the asset, not necessarily what you're doing the money with. So I think that was something that we chatted about a bit.
That's a helpful clarification, Julie. Ed and Ted, how about your session? Quick wrap.
So I would characterize ours as sort of an intimate discussion that was networking as much as anything else. But I would say for those of you that are interested in the state revolving fund programs and how to maybe look at best management practices and sharing of information, especially along the lines of green infrastructure for stormwater, we had a very good discussion with Sanjeev, and I would urge you to reach out to him as well for continued sharing of information.
Great. Yes, Sanjeev is always a good resource. Thanks, Ted. And thanks to the whole panel. You guys did an awesome job. I apologize for my technical challenges, but we got a lot of good discussion through this. And again, thank you, Caroline, for organizing all of this.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Margaret, and to everyone. We really appreciate your time, and we hope that everyone in the session is able to use what they learned today. I know I learned a ton. Every time I hear this panel speak, I always learn something. So we do have up next our keynote. I encourage you to head right over there and hear from Representative Jared Huffman, as well as our Impact and Emerging Leader Award ceremonies. Very inspiring stories. So I hope to see you all over there. And again, thank you so much to everyone. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Caroline.